Today's video is sponsored by Crossout, a totally free-to-play vehicle shooter game where players build their own vehicle and pit themselves against other players' creations. Now, Crossout isn't one of those supposedly customizable games where it's like, yeah, you get to choose the type of ammo in the guns. No, this is a truly customizable game. Players are tasked with building their own combat vehicle from the ground up. You get the bones and then you decide on everything else yourself. Drivetrains, support systems, paint jobs, and of course, weaponry. Want to cover the backside in a chainsaw? You got it. How about Gatling guns on either side, a crossbow on top? Why not? If you build it well, you will dominate, and if you build it badly, well, you won't. You'll get destroyed really quickly by other people. But it's an easy learning curve. You'll get there. It's a super fast-paced game with lots of different game modes, including PvP and PvE raids, and you've also got pretty much limitless freedom to create. Look, one thing I like about Crossout is, like I said, it's an easy learning curve. It's accessible right from the start. You just fire up the game and you'll be battling in no time, learning the ropes, just immediate gameplay. But you can also learn to master it. It grows with you. Best of all, it's totally free to play, PC, Xbox, or PlayStation. Lots of options for lots of different types of gamers. So go to exo.link/today I found out XO bonus. And because that's a bit of a nightmare, there's a link below and you'll get a free bonus pack, including very special parts and paint. Very cool. Thank you to Crossout for sponsoring, and now today's video. In the latter half of the 20th century, no single technology shaped the course of the world more than nuclear power. The ultimate double-edged sword. In the Cold War era, the power of the atom came to represent both the promise of a utopian technological future and the looming threat of nuclear Armageddon. In a bid to realize the seemingly limitless potential of the atom and outdo their Cold War rivals in the nuclear arms race, in the 1950s and 60s, engineers on both sides of the Iron Curtain proposed a bewildering number of unorthodox applications for nuclear power, including the propulsion of a wide variety of vehicles. While today nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers are proven fixtures of several navies, these Cold War proposals did not stop at military vessels, with engineers drafting tables overflowing with plans for nuclear-powered cargo and passenger ships, trains, and even consumer automobiles. And then there was that time the United States and Soviet Union attempted to build one of the most terrifying weapons ever conceived, a nuclear-powered bomber aircraft. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, RDS-1, shattering the United States' nuclear monopoly and forever changing the balance of global power. Over the next 4 decades, both superpowers would amass ever more powerful and sophisticated nuclear stockpiles, capable of destroying the Earth several times over the push of a button. In the early days, however, the only effective means of delivering a nuclear weapon to its target was via manned bomber aircraft. Unfortunately, this delivery had several serious disadvantages. Bomber aircraft were slow and unmaneuverable, making them vulnerable to enemy interceptor aircraft and anti-aircraft missiles. They also had limited range, meaning air bases had to be built as close to the enemy's border as possible in order for the aircraft to be able to reach their targets. Indeed, to this end, the United States offered Denmark $100 million in gold to purchase Greenland and convert it into a giant bomber base. Denmark declined the offer, but allowed the US Air Force to maintain an airbase at Thule for nuclear-armed B-52 Stratofortress jet bombers. Then there was the problem of second strike capability. At the time, nuclear doctrine called for enemy air bases and other nuclear facilities to be targeted first, eliminating the enemy's ability to retaliate and allowing other targets, like cities, to be attacked with impunity. This problem became especially acute with the development of land and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. In response, in 1960, the United States Air Force launched Operation Chrome Dome, wherein at least 3 nuclear-armed B-52 bombers were kept airborne at all times, flying airborne alert patrols near the Soviet border around Alaska, Greenland, and the Mediterranean Sea. In the case of nuclear war breaking out, the bombers would dash across the border, drop their weapons on pre-designated targets, and boom. The scheme allowed the United States to maintain second strike capability even if a surprise Soviet first strike succeeded in destroying all other nuclear forces on the ground. While Chrome Dome ran successfully until 1968, it was not without its flaws. Maintaining 24-hour patrols near the Soviet border required the use of in-flight refueling and remote forward air bases, both of which increased the risk of accidents. Indeed, on January 17, 1966, a Chrome Dome B-52 collided with its tanker aircraft during in-flight refueling and broke apart, causing 4 1-megaton B-28 thermonuclear bombs to fall to Earth near Palomares in Spain. 1 bomb landed intact, 1 landed in the sea, and 1 was recovered after a lengthy search operation. The conventional explosives in the remaining 2 bombs detonated on impact, contaminating a nearly square kilometer of land with plutonium. 2 years later, on January the 21st, 1968, another B-52 caught fire and crashed near Thule Air Force Base in Greenland. Once again, the conventional explosives in the 4 B-28 bombs detonated, contaminating a large area of the sea with plutonium. More than a decade before these incidents, however, US military planners came up with a unique, if rather batshit crazy solution for maintaining continuous airborne alert. Nuclear-powered bomber. Nuclear fuel is incredibly energy-dense, with a kilogram of uranium producing more than 3 million times the energy of a kilogram of coal. A nuclear-powered aircraft could thus theoretically remain airborne for weeks or even months at a time without needing to refuel. This would eliminate many of the risks later associated with Operation Chrome Dome and give the United States a significant strategic advantage over the Soviet Union. Incredibly, the idea of a nuclear-powered aircraft was first seriously proposed by Italian physicist Enrico Fermi in 1942, the same year he and his colleague built and operated the world's first crude nuclear reactor. In May 1946, less than 1 year after the end of the Second World War, the United States Army Air Force launched the Nuclear Energy for the Propulsion of Aircraft, or NEPA project, to evaluate the feasibility of building such an aircraft. The project presented a large number of daunting engineering challenges, including building a reactor light and compact enough to be carried by an aircraft, designing powerful and reliable nuclear-powered engines, shielding the aircraft's crew from the massive amounts of radiation spewed out by the reactor, and preventing the catastrophic release of radioactive contamination in case of crash or other accidents. Preliminary research began at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, with the construction of a unique and sophisticated nuclear reactor known as the Aircraft Reactor Experiment, or ARE. Unlike conventional nuclear reactors in which the uranium fuel is contained in solid rods or pins, ARE's fuel was dissolved in a mixture of molten fluorine salts and circulated through a core made of beryllium oxide blocks, which reflected neutrons back into the core to sustain the nuclear chain reaction. Liquid sodium metal and helium gas were used to cool the core. At first, engineers fitted the ARE with conventional neutron-absorbing control rods, only to discover that these had no effect on the reactor's power input. Rather, the output was determined by the reactor's temperature and thus the power demand, meaning that once connected to a power load like a nuclear-powered jet engine, the reactor would effectively be self-regulating. ARE was operated at power for a total of 221 hours and reached a peak power output of 2.5 megawatts, proving that a reactor lightweight and powerful enough to propel an aircraft was technically feasible. In 1951, NEPA was replaced by the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion, or ANP project, a joint venture between the US Air Force and the US Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC. The goal of this project was to produce a functioning nuclear-powered bomber aircraft, which was given the designation Weapons System, or WS-125A. 2 companies, General Electric and Pratt & Whitney, were contracted to produce prototype nuclear-powered aircraft engines operating on 2 different principles: open cycle and closed cycle. Both systems worked on nearly identical principles. In a regular jet engine, air enters the engine and passes through a compressor into a combustion chamber. Here it is mixed with fuel and ignited, producing hot, high-pressure exhaust gas. This gas is passed through a turbine and out the rear of the engine, producing thrust, while a small amount of energy from the turbine is used to drive the compressor, completing the cycle. A nuclear-powered jet engine works in much the same way, except that the thermal energy is provided not by burning fuel, but the heat from a nuclear reactor. In General Electric's open-cycle system, air was passed from the compressor directly through the core of the reactor, where it absorbed heat from the nuclear reaction. The heated air was then returned to the engine and passed through the turbine and exhaust nozzle, producing thrust. While this system had the advantage of being lightweight, compact, and efficient, unfortunately, this came at the minor cost of the jet exhaust being highly radioactive. By contrast, Pratt & Whitney's closed-cycle engine featured a closed cooling loop filled with liquid sodium metal, which carried heat from the reactor core to a heat exchanger in the jet engine. This heat was then transferred to the air coming out of the compressor, with the rest of the power cycle proceeding normally. While heavier and less efficient than GE's system, the closed-cycle engine had the advantage of releasing far less radioactive contamination into the environment. However, the closed-cycle engine proved more difficult and costly to perfect, and for the sake of expedience, the ANP project chose to pursue GE's open-cycle engine. While GE's experimental nuclear propulsion system, known as the Heat Transfer Reactor Experiment, or HTRE, would not be successfully tested until January the 31st, 1956, ANP nonetheless decided to move forward with preliminary flight tests of airborne nuclear reactors. All they needed was a suitable aircraft to serve as a testbed. As luck would have it, on September 1st, 1952, a tornado tore through Carswell Air Force Base in Texas, damaging several aircraft, including a Convair B-36 Peacemaker bomber. The largest aircraft ever operated by the US Air Force, the gargantuan B-36 measured 50 meters long, had a wingspan of 70 meters, and could carry a payload of 39,000 kilograms of bombs over a range of 16,000 kilometers. The Peacemaker, everybody. Later versions were powered by no fewer than 6 28-cylinder piston engines and 4 turbojet engines, inspiring the aircraft's slogan, 6 turning, 4 burning. As part of a sub-project of ANP dubbed MX-1589, the B-36 was stripped of its defensive armament and fitted with a 3-megawatt air-cooled reactor known as the Aircraft Shield Test Reactor, or ASTR. This reactor did not actually power the aircraft and was instead intended to test the feasibility and the effects of operating a reactor in flight. The reactor was suspended by a single hook in the aircraft's bomb bay, allowing it to be easily removed and stored in a special concrete-lined pit between test flights. Heat from the reactor core was carried via a water coolant loop to a set of heat exchangers which dissipated into the atmosphere, while radioactive gases given off by the reactor were monitored by a system amusingly dubbed Project Halitosis. The most significant structural changes, however, were to the aircraft's cockpit, which was fitted with 12 tons of lead, borated rubber, and water shielding. This shielding was designed to be easily reconfigured in order to find the optimal arrangement that both adequately protected the crew and minimized weight. As only the pilot and co-pilot could see outside through the aircraft's 15-centimeter thick lead glass windshield, closed-circuit television cameras and screens were installed in the bomb bay and rear cockpit to allow the crew to monitor the reactor in flight. The modified aircraft was designated the NB-36H Crusader. If preliminary tests were successful, the project would move on to construction of a nuclear-powered version of a B-36 known as the Convair X6. The NB-36H first flew on September 17, 1955. Between September 1955 and March 1957, the aircraft made 47 test flights over New Mexico and Texas and logged 215 flight hours, 89 of which were flown with the reactor powered up. These tests revealed that while operating a reactor in flight was relatively straightforward, the amount of shielding needed to protect the crew severely limited the aircraft's payload capacity, making it of dubious value as a bomber. While some planners believed these problems could eventually be overcome with more experimentation, others proposed a more elegant and horrific solution: remove most of the shielding and man the aircraft with older crews. As the brutal logic went, older crew members were likely to have already had children, meaning increased radiation exposure would pose no threat to future generations. They were also more likely to die of other causes long before they could develop radiation-induced cancer. Though disturbing to us today, this starkly ageist survival calculus was typical of the era. In his seminal 1960s work on thermonuclear war, Rand Corporation theorist Herman Kahn recommended dividing food supplies into 5 grades depending on their level of radioactive contamination. Grade A was perfectly clean food for consumption by pregnant women, while Grade A was heavily contaminated food for feeding to animals. All of those aged 55 years or older would receive Grade D food. Unsurprisingly, Kahn was one of the main inspirations for the title character of Stanley Kubrick's 1964 film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Despite these unanswered questions, by 1956 the ANP team was confident that a nuclear-powered strategic bomber was feasible, with David F. Shaw, general manager of General Electric's ANP program department, stating, "It is no longer a question of can we build a nuclear-powered aircraft system, but when we can place such a system in an aircraft. We have reached the point that we can say that when an airframe is ready, we can have the nuclear direct air cycle power place ready for installation." However, at the end of 1956, the Pentagon decided that ANP was too far away from producing a viable weapon system and a drain on resources, and abruptly cancelled the program. After completing its final flight in March 1957, the NB-36H was sent to Convair's nuclear aircraft research facility in Fort Worth, Texas, where its ASTR reactor was removed and the airframe was scrapped. Despite ANP's cancellation, both General Electric and Pratt & Whitney were given permission to continue their research into nuclear aircraft engines. GE continued to upgrade its HTRE system, eventually producing a version called the HTRE-3 that could run on both nuclear power and conventional jet fuel. This was a highly desirable ability for a potential nuclear bomber, as it meant the reactor could be safely powered down during takeoff and landing, the most dangerous parts of any flight. The system also proved more than capable of the high endurance needed needed for long-duration patrols, operating continuously for 120 hours at a maximum output of 35 megawatts. Over the following years, several attempts would be made to resurrect the ANP project, spurred by a number of Cold War panics. The first of these was the launch of Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, on October 4th, 1957. The new threat posed by Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles like the R-7 that had launched Sputnik convinced many at the Pentagon that a nuclear-powered bomber was needed more than ever, with one report stating, "The Russians are from 3 to 5 years ahead of the US in the field of atomic aircraft engines and will move even further ahead unless the US presses forward with its own program." However, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower did not share his general sense of urgency, though he did approve $150 million in funding per year to support GE and Pratt & Whitney's engine development efforts. The second crisis came the following year when an article appeared in the December 1st, 1958 issue of the magazine Aviation Week, claiming that the Soviets had leapfrogged the United States in the field of nuclear-powered aircraft. The article read, in part, "A nuclear-powered bomber is being flight tested in the Soviet Union. Completed about 6 months ago, this aircraft has been flying in the Moscow area for at least 2 months. It has been observed both in flight and on the ground by a wide variety of foreign observers from communist and non-communist countries. The Soviet aircraft is a prototype of a design to perform a military mission as a continuous airborne alert warning system and missile launching platform." Included in the article were photographs of the sleek supersonic Russian bomber and diagrams speculating as to its internal layout. So widely circulated were these images that the manufacturer Aurora even produced a plastic model kit of the aircraft. Alarmed by this new development, Congress hastily approved a new round of funding for the ANP project. However, this brief resurrection did not survive the election of President John F. Kennedy, who on March 28, 1961, permanently cancelled the ANP project, writing, "Nearly 15 years and about $1 billion have been devoted to the attempted development of a nuclear-powered aircraft, but the possibility of achieving a militarily useful aircraft in the foreseeable future is still very remote." In the end, the advanced Soviet nuclear bomber that had so frightened Congress turned out to be a hoax, and the photos in the Aviation Week article were of the conventionally powered and unsuccessful Myasishchev M50 Bounder supersonic bomber. However, the Soviets had been pursuing their own parallel nuclear-powered bomber project, though ultimately they came to the same conclusion as the Americans. The Soviet program began on August 12, 1955, when the Council of Ministers of the USSR issued a directive calling upon the country's bomber design bureaus to collaborate on the design of a long-range nuclear-powered strategic bomber. The Tupolev and Myasishchev bureaus were tasked with developing the airframe, while the Kuznetsov and Zluka bureaus would develop the nuclear jet engines. Unlike the American counterparts, the Soviet designers estimated it would take decades to produce a working prototype, with the first nuclear-powered flight projected for sometime in the late 1970s or early 80s. In order to cost-effectively test out different reactor and shielding designs and operational procedures, like the Americans, the Soviets decided to adapt an existing airframe, in this case the turboprop-powered Tupolev 95 Bear, the standard Soviet strategic nuclear bomber. The testbed aircraft was fitted with a VVR-L-100 nuclear reactor mounted in the bomb bay, though as the Tu-95's airframe was smaller than the B-36's, special aerodynamic fairings had to be built on top and bottom of the fuselage to fit the reactor. Several tons of sodium, beryllium oxide, cadmium, paraffin wax, and steel were also added to the cockpit to shield the crew from the reactor's radiation, and the converted aircraft was designated the Tupolev Tu-95 LAL for Leta Yushchaya Atomnaya Laboratoria, or Flying Nuclear Laboratory. Like the NB-36H, the reactor was not connected to the aircraft's engines, the aircraft's purpose being to investigate the challenges of operating a reactor in flight. Between 1961 and 1969, the Tu-95 LAL made around 40 test flights, the majority with the reactor shut down. As with the American ANP program, these flights revealed that the amount of shielding required to protect the crew made the aircraft of marginal value as a bomber, though, like the Americans, the Soviets also came up with the idea of flying the aircraft with older crews to get around this problem. Nonetheless, the project was considered to have sufficient merit that work soon began on the follow-up Tu-119, a modified Tu-95 with 2 nuclear-powered engines inboard and 2 conventional turboprop engines outboard. If successful, the Tu-119 was to be followed by the Tupolev Tu-132 and Myasishchev M60 Mach 2 capable nuclear jet-powered bombers. However, by the mid-1960s, Soviet interest in nuclear-powered aircraft was waning. Improved surface-to-air missile technology had made manned bombers extremely vulnerable, while intercontinental ballistic missiles, which gave little warning of their arrival and were almost impossible to shoot down, had rendered them nearly obsolete. Furthermore, the problem of maintaining second strike capability had been effectively solved by the invention of submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Consequently, in 1966, the Tu-119 project was cancelled. Tupolev and Myasishchev continued design work on the Tu-132 and M60 until 1969, when the Soviet government put an end to all nuclear-powered aircraft projects. With that, a bold but terrifying chapter in the nuclear arms race came to a close. Or did it? In 2019, the Russian government revealed that it was developing a weapon known as the 9M730 Burevestnik, or Storm Petrel, an experimental long-range cruise missile propelled by a nuclear turbojet engine. Like the proposed manned nuclear bombers of the 1950s and 60s, the Burevestnik's nuclear power plants would give the missile near unlimited range and endurance, allowing it to loiter near an enemy's border and avoid anti-aircraft defenses until ordered into action. The resurrection of such frightening technology by the government of Vladimir Putin just goes to show that while you can take the man out of the Cold War, you apparently can't take the Cold War out of the man. Thanks again to CrossApp for sponsoring today's video. Remember, you can try CrossApp's free-to-play game by visiting the unique URL exo.link/AdairFoundOutXO bonus. There's a link below as well. Doing that, you'll get some exclusive in-game bonuses. Go check them out, and thank you for watching.